Welcome to Sculpture Vulture. I'm Lucy Branch, a sculptural conservator and author, bringing you a series of interviews with some amazing sculptors who inspire me, and I hope will do the same for you. You can see the photographs accompanying the interview, the episode show notes, and get a free novel from sculpturevulture.co.uk. Hello, Sculpture Vultures, and thank you for joining me today. Since last episode, I've enjoyed a very nice birthday, thoroughly spoiled, and particularly relevant to the podcast is that my husband and middle son decided to build me a proper sound booth for my recordings in my writing room. I couldn't have received a better gift, actually, because I was really struggling with the little pokey corner that I'd allocated to the recordings, and it didn't work at all. And logistically, there was just so many cables everywhere, and it was just a complete nightmare. And I really needed that help to try and sort it all out. There's a few tweaks still need to be made here and there and bits to be finished off, but it is streets ahead of the setup that I previously had. And actually sitting here, it's put me in mind of a book that I read years ago, I think by Stephen Pressfield. I think it's called Going Pro. And he talks about the passage from being an amateur to a professional, and how, above all, it's about changing your mindset and the way you do things with regard to what you're creating, so that you start behaving in all aspects like a professional. And now that I've sat here in my wonderful booth, I realise that I really wasn't behaving like a professional with my podcast, because I hadn't arranged it in a particularly professional way. And he talks about how important it is to take yourself seriously and treat whatever you're creating with the greatest of respect. And this new little setup is going to help me do that. It means that the podcast has graduated from this little fancy I had, this little idea, to becoming part of my body of work alongside my practical conservation work and my writing. But don't fear, I'm not going to rattle on about my birthday anymore. Today I have Eve Shepherd, who I was planning to interview this season anyway, as she has jumped the queue slightly because she's been shortlisted for the Emily Williamson statue campaign, which has that end of October deadline. But she has already done some wonderful public commissions, including works for the National Maritime Museum and a portrait of Professor Stephen Hawkins for Cambridge University, among many others. And there's a particularly significant one happening in the pipeline this year, but I will let her tell you all about it rather than me. So I began our conversation today by asking her when sculpture had first come into her life.
Well, I think I didn't come from a creative background, so I didn't know that I could sculpt until I was about 17. And I wanted to do special effects in films, and I knew that there was a sculptor just up the road from where I was at college. And I went and did some door knocking and sort of said, give a job. And he said, I can't actually pay you anything, but if you want to come and do some work just in the corner of my studio, you're very welcome. And so that's where I sort of began. And I only wanted to learn how to do casting, mould making, because I didn't realise that I could sculpt. And one day he just sort of said to me, can you sculpt a mouse? And I was like, I have no idea where to begin. And he just chucked me a lump of clay and went, here you are. And so I sculpted this mouse. And from that, he saw that I could sculpt. I'd got some sort of ability. And then he kind of stood me in the corner of his freezing cold studio with holes in the floor. And it just went, can you sculpt a head and have this expression, this age, this gender? And it was the same head that I just sort of morphed from one thing to another, to another, to another. And from that, I learned a lot about anatomy and also sculpting quickly. And he was kind of gearing me up for the museum and heritage industry, which is, after about 4 or 5 months, he then handed me on to a big company in York. So I was sort of born and raised in Sheffield, and then I was handed on to this company in York that was a huge international company working in this massive aircraft hangar. And that's sort of where I had to hit the ground running. And it was like self-taught, really, because I got fabulous opportunities. Nobody had the time to guide me through it that much. There was a chap there called Peter Donahoe. He was my boss. He would point me in the right direction, but it was very much hit the ground running. And it was life-size figure after life-size figure. It was speedy, quick learning.
What specifically was the company about?
So it was a combination. We were predominantly the museum and heritage industry, so it was like a lower budget Madame Tussauds.
Okay.
And we but it was less about sort of getting likenesses. It was less about portraiture and more about everyday life. So you'd sculpt, I don't know, a woman. The amount of women stirring pot and man holding gun that I had to do was unbelievable. And I just did hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these life-size, over life-size, under life-size figures over the years, and that was my stomping ground. And I also, when I was 21, I got promoted to running the department. So then I was running a department of other sculptors, quality checking, still sculpting myself, working out in Israel a little bit to do various projects, and sort of moved around. But yeah, it was great training for a life as a sculptor, because you not only learn grassroots of sculpting accurately and fast, but then also I also learned about management and how to work with other people and what to expect of other people and how to push the boat and really to push a sculpture a little bit further.
What were they making these sculptures in? What medium were they making them into?
So they were predominantly, I sculpted them in clay, and then they were either made predominantly in fiberglass or bronze resin, or occasionally in bronze, but not very often, or occasionally in wax, but again, not very often. We did some papier-mâché for one ecological exhibition that didn't want resin. So it was a whole mixture of things, but it was a lower budget, so we didn't have to sort of find the cost for bronzes, because a lot of these things were shown indoors.
So you said you didn't come from a sculpting family, but was there anyone at home who was creative?
No, but I mean, my mum had a very creative mindset. And so and she was very encouraging for me to do what I wanted to do, because I wasn't interested in lots of other things like academia and school. It really just left me cold. But I loved art, and I loved, and I'd go off and I'd spend hours making things and teaching myself, things. And I'd always got this, and I've always got this thirst for more information, doing things differently. So the path that I just told you about, I'd spent a couple of years doing all those things. By the time I was 19, I was bored. I'd been sculpting these figures since 17. By 19, I was really bored, and I was looking for other things, which is why the promotions happened, because the company wanted to hold on to me. So they were like, well, just, promote you and you can do this now. But I just found it too tedious. So I got to a certain point when I was in my early 20s where I was sort of like, what's more? There must be more to just a life-size figure, or to just an accurate depiction of a human being. I was so through with that. And that's when I started developing my own artwork. And I think it was that curiosity that my mum gave me when I was little, to always learn, to always ask questions, and to just be curious. And I think that's a big part of being creative. And that was sort of the essence. And my dad's very practical, and I come from a long line from the male side of steel workers. So there's this like grassroots methodology, practical, will it work, which is also really handy for sculpture, because there's the fundamentals that you have to get right, like will it stand up, and how long will it last outside or inside, and will anybody dangle off it, and will it be safe if they do, things like that. Yeah. So that's kind of what I think I got from them too. And the big thing as well that my mum introduced was nature. So we were very much encouraged. We walked straight out of our back garden into a woodland, and we used to walk through the woodland to school every morning. And we were constantly, looking at leaves and trees and animals, and I think that wonder for nature is a big part of what I do.
Gosh, that sounds idyllic, wandering through the woodland to school.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Can't imagine that, seeing as we're all cooped up in London like battery chickens. But Did you become more interested in portraits once you began to create your own work, or I don't know, it sounds like you were almost done with making people, so I'm quite surprised that portraits drew you along.
I've always been interested in people, and it's people more than portraits that I'm interested.
Okay.
That's my sort of goal. And I didn't know that I could create portraits until I was working at the company that I mentioned, and then they just used to give me all the portraits to do. So whenever there was anything a bit more finite, they'd just chuck it in my direction. I was like, why are you giving them to me? I want to sculpt a dinosaur, because at that point, I was young and wanted different stuff. And then I think I just sort of I'm really interested in getting to know like the nuances of a person, like beyond what they look like. I find that anatomical accuracy is, for me, I find it really, it's dull. If that's all you can bring into a piece of work, predominantly, it doesn't breathe. So, my focus is on all the stuff underneath, how people are, what they've been through, how their face changes, if they're with you, obviously. If they're not with us anymore, then that brings a whole different level of things to understand. But yeah, if you're dealing with that person sat in front of you, you can sort of see all the different expressions that they go through, and all the things that they talk about, and how their face changes and how their posture changes as part of that.
So is that part of your process, the visual study, or do you research people?
No, I research people.
Okay.
And I'll try and research them from as many different angles as possible, because it's believing and understanding that every single one of us is multifaceted. I think that's the reason why for many years I stopped producing public work, because a lot of the stuff that I was being asked to do was like this. They were mainly sort of white and male, and there was almost like this one-dimensional quality that was required, and I just couldn't believe in it. So I just didn't do it anymore.
That's a very brave thing to do, though. I mean, when things are coming at you and they're obviously good work, it's really hard to say no to that.
Well, it sort of went a bit beyond that. So I'd done all of this work for this company that I mentioned, and for various other companies. I went freelance, and then I kind of got my own company and worked for lots of other big sort of museums and stuff throughout the world. And then whilst I was doing that, so I used to do that for 6 months out of the year, and then I used to do my own work for 6 months out of the year. And after years of doing that, and I went to Chelsea as well for a few months in the middle of that, I then burnt out. And it got to a point where I literally couldn't make myself do anything that I didn't believe in. So it really was like my lesson in respecting the art form and not being so blasé, because I'd been so blasé to that point about, if you want that doing, absolutely knock it up, no problem. Then it became something much more discerning and precious, I suppose, to me, that the actual making of something, because I couldn't take it for granted. So now I can only do things that I can absolutely get behind, and I think there's a place for them, and they're required in the world.
And do you think that that's what began to give you traction as a professional sculptor, sort of doing your own work, that truth to the creative flow and that creative spirit, I suppose, that's in good sculpture?
Yeah, I think, when I stopped doing the commissioned work, I'd already started doing my own work, and so I was doing that, and sort of producing lots and lots of that, and that was talking about this more kind of internal world, I suppose. It was this emotional world that that's often hidden within us. And I think with sculpture, or with any kind of visual art, if it's done well, it can portray that emotion that actually can be quite complex, but other people can look at it, and if they've been through a similar thing, they can feel touched by it, and they can also feel heard. There's a recognition, and I think that can create a lot of soothing. And so I think as an artist, like, that's where I see my work lies within. It's kind of this communication of something that you can't speak about.
Yeah, the unsaid. I love that
The
about your work.
Yeah, and I thank you. And I think it's that sort of came across. I think I had to go through this thing where I'd burnt out, and it was like a rite of passage where I stopped being this kind of like young in my heart, young in my mind, kind of sculptor that I was very established and experienced. I like kids can be, they can be quite blasé and sort of, run along with things and not see the importance of certain things. And I needed to do a rite of passage, which was the burnout, to get from that stage to this stage where I started to take what I wanted. Well, I started to communicate what I wanted to say, and what I hoped people maybe needed to hear. And it's the same with the public work. Just sort of going back to that, I wanted to get to a point where my own work and the more commission-y sort of work would merge. And so you've got this sort of slightly looser quality, but you've also got this information within it, a story and a message that needs to be maybe spoken. So that's where now I've kind of merged it with the commissioned work a little bit more, which is where, certainly the last two commissions that I've been working on, and the possible Emily next one, who knows, it all comes from that same place.
Yeah, but there is that thing where to have a sort of platform to leap from, in a sense, because you need to have enough work to be able to pay those bills and all that kind of, the boring, mundane stuff in life.
Yeah.
But yet sometimes the audience isn't ready to hear what you want to say. Like, they're not prepared to pay for what you feel is ready to be said. And so there's always that moment where you have to kind of think, well, I'm just going to go for it.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be really true to that. But it's a really tough thing when you've got life to deal with as well. And
it is.
And it doesn't always come in sync, does it? So that people aren't always prepared to pay for it at the moment you need that thing to be paid for. It usually comes along in a huge amount of it, maybe later.
It's terrifying. I mean, I think, I'm working class. I don't have sort of family money to fall back on, which some people do in the art world. It's absolutely terrifying. It's had such hairy moments this whole career. Yeah, you just have to keep going. And I think in some ways that having the burnout meant that the option of doing more commercial or commissioned work was just ruled out for a while, and so it was awful. But it was also, I had to do something else, and the one thing that I knew how to do was sculpt, and that allowed me about a decade to cultivate my own voice, which is why when I now do public work or all my own work, it kind of has this sort of, I suppose, quite a unique quality, and it's in this weird space between traditional work and contemporary conceptual. So it bridges the gap, I think, between the two. So it allows more accessibility from both sides. But it was a hard slog getting there. It was. Yeah, I wouldn't want to go back to those years.
It sounds like the universe made the decision for you. It's like, you know what, we've got to put her on her path, and the only way to do that is to completely exhaust you beyond measure.
And listen to the muse. I mean, there is that, whatever, want of a better expression, the universal consciousness of the creative spirit. I don't know, whatever you want to call it. But if I don't listen to it, and listen to it well, then I get injured. And, the burnout was one of them, but I also broke my own back, and I had to have emergency surgery and was nearly paralysed. And
you're joking.
So that was 2011. So I have to be so mindful now about what I pick up, how I pick things up, whether something's worth it. It's
Was it a freak accident, or was it to do with work?
Overwork.
Oh, you're joking.
No. So, it's all that. I think when you've got one of those mindsets that's so sort of driven and wanting to, I don't know, just to do what you do.
Yeah.
I found it quite easy to put myself off to one side and not listen. And as a result of that, I've come a cropper quite a few times, and thankfully, I'm still with it. But yeah, it's not an easy path. I think there are easier ones, and looking back in hindsight, I could have, I could have.
I think it's a certain type of personality, actually, though, that sort of
Yeah,
that very, you're so focused, you want it so much, and you need that kind of personality actually to succeed. But your body is only. It's only going to put up with so much. I'm forever. I've always got one thing or another, and I keep thinking to myself, one of these days I'm just going to go through a period where I haven't managed to damage something.
yeah,
But so far
yeah.
I haven't managed to find that period. There's always something that I had about 2 years where I could hardly move my wrists, and this was in the days years before voice activated software was actually good. But
Right.
I realised that if I'd been working for anyone else, I'd have just been redundant because I couldn't use a computer. I had to use, so I had to use voice activated software, but it was so clunky and difficult.
Yeah.
And I was just like, but just repetitive work too much over and over again.
Yeah.
And, it didn't only stop the practical work, it also stopped all the computer work that you have to do as a business.
Yeah.
I just find my body constantly says it's not necessarily the same problem I have, it's a different bit of me. I'm just falling apart all over the place.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. No, me too. I mean, I came back from Wales a couple of days ago, just sort of checking out some work at a foundry up there, and I was literally about to drive back, and this has happened twice now. My back just went, and I just went, actually, I'm not going to drive back. I'm going to have one more night here for myself.
Yeah.
And, and took it, and then did some creative stuff as a result of that I really, like, my soul just really needed to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it's quite an obsessive, I think, mindset, and I think that sort of hooked together with a sense of purpose. If you feel like your artwork does have a sense of purpose, which I think over time I've sort of understood from the responses that I've got, that I think mine does have a certain sense of purpose. Then there's a responsibility as well that comes with that. And so, you kind of constantly checking yourself and checking what you're doing and making sure that, the message that you're speaking about, the stories that you're speaking about are accurate, and, and they don't portray something else. And, it's all the other,
the parts. So do you have a sort of creative routine, or do you have anything that you do each day that helps you get in that zone to work?
Oh God, I wish I did. Like, in my head, I'm like, oh, that would be great, wouldn't it, to just do that for a couple of hours in the morning, and then that, and then that. No, but I wish I did.
So there's not like 9 yoga poses before I get on there.
Yeah, in my head, yeah, no. In reality, absolutely not. I'm like, oh, I'll get up early and I'll do some Pilates.
Yeah.
And followed by a bit of meditation, and no, and then I sort of roll out of bed at just before whatever time and have to get my daughter up and hike her off to school. So no, I think it's easier that if you don't have kids.
Yeah,
I think being a creative and being a woman and having kids is like a whole other ball game. Like, there should be specialist degree courses in that, I think.
multi-dimensional life.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment I think it's predominantly mums that kind of take the brunt of, when you're creative and you're I'm sure it could be the same for
well they are our greatest creation, aren't they? So you sort of want to facilitate absolutely everything so that they can progress. But no, I do love the idea that one day I'm actually find someone that has got this. They're like, oh yes, the answer to getting in creative flow is, I don't know, drinking this followed by dancing round 17 times and I don't know, I want someone to do something really wild.
So what I do try and do when it's not the kids' holidays is I do have some semblance of routine, if I can get it, that is, where I kind of get I kind of a borrowed office space, because I find that my environment's really critical, and I can't do office work in the studio. It's just impossible. I just get distracted. So I go to there for a couple of hours and try and get my admin done and free my mind up for doing other things. And then I sort of wander down to the studio and then crack on with a couple of hours of creative work. But to be honest, the creative work's taken a bit of a backseat at the minute because I've been doing a lot of the more kind of tedious stuff that's connected with commissions, when you've done the creative stuff, and then you've got, the checking of the waxes and the making sure the plinth's all right, and the dimension, blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
But tedious, but so essential,
Really essential.
because it can
really
come out so wrong otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, no, really, really essential. But what happens is, as a creative, I'm sure you'll know as well with your writing, while you're doing that work, you can't do the other work.
No.
And so you get to the end of like a week or a month, and you're like, what have I actually made that's new at the end? And nothing, actually. I've taken to writing now, because I'm just like, at least I could do that on travel,
I know. I mean, I just find as well that the kind of mind I have to go over things several times. I can't just check things once. I never get it just once. So that time I've allocated is always actually kind of trebled in the end to get it right, because otherwise the times that I've done it just once and then absolutely wanted to kick myself for not having seen something which I just was blind to because I was fixating so much on something else. So I totally sympathise. Yeah,
so like you, I'm fastidious. So if it's like, one dimension connected to a plinth, it's like check it 5 times, make sure it's okay, Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what you've been doing recently. Obviously, the Emily Williamson campaign is front and foremost, but that's not the only thing you've been up to.
Great. I'm really enjoying the Emily Williamson campaign. I think Andrew is doing an absolute sterling job, and so is Tessa as well, Tessa Boza, which I don't think you've spoken to her.
No, I haven't yet. No.
She's a superstar as well. I love it. I mean, I love what they're doing. I think getting out into the general public, which is what they're doing at the moment, and taking the maquettes around to the RSPB reserves is great, because I never get to meet the people. You just end up in the studio on your own. So I love it. It's so nice getting to talk to people that you'd never normally come across or necessarily talk to. It's great. Anyway, sorry, went off topic, but you asked about what else I'm doing. So I've got a huge project, which is to sculpt the first woman of notoriety in Wales. And it's a woman called Betty Campbell, and she was selected by the general public, and she's the first black head teacher in Wales, and she also was one of the founders of Black History Month, and she worked on the board of the BBC, trying to equalise the sort of the black history within the broadcasts, and lots of other things. She was a local councillor and a community champion. So she was a real mover and a shaker. She died in 2017. So she lived in Cardiff, and this piece is for Cardiff city centre. But it's unique, and it's not just a figure on a plinth.
And did you say the first sculpture of a bronze sculpture of a woman in Wales?
Of notoriety.
Of notoriety. That's incredible.
Yeah, We've probably got several Queen Victorias, because every
Everywhere.
city needs to have, every country. But basically none. And I mean, the thing is, there's I don't know if it still stands, but I know a couple of years ago the statistics were that there's more sculptures of dogs in the UK than there are of women of notoriety. And so, and I think on the back of that, the committee, the Welsh Women's Monument Committee, who were organising this, and they're also organising another 4 sculptures of women of notoriety in Wales. This is the first, and they were the ones that really got on the back of this and went, why aren't there more sculptures of women? Where do young girls and women go to be inspired? So it's an amazing job. It's a really unique piece of work, iconic, it's been described as, and it's taken a lot of my time, a lot of time, because there's so much information.
It's going to be a very heavyweight project. That no way that you're going to get away just by like used to knocking them out in the studio years ago.
No,
and
no.
You'd be furious with yourself if it was any different. So it's going to be very special.
Well, I've made this piece a lot like actually the Emily Williamson piece as well. I think because of lockdown, though I did the design for Betty 2 years ago, over 2 years ago actually, and I don't know what it was, but I just kind of, this often happens where I'll design something and then something happens after the date and it seems relevant when I didn't understand why I was making it at the beginning. But when I designed Betty, the Betty Monument, it kind of incorporates the multi-ethnicity of the area that Betty was born and raised in. And also as well, Betty, obviously, of being sort of non-white descent. And this has happened a few weird times in my career where I've sculpted something and I've thought, why the hell am I sculpting this? I don't get it. Like, why is it relevant? And then all of a sudden, a few months after, or yeah, usually a few months after, something happens, something really significant. And I'm like, oh my God, that was bizarre. Don't get it. I don't understand why it happens. But I did it with a piece called Face Off many years ago. And it's these two young fellas looking at each other. And it's actually just one young man and he's looking at himself. And from certain angles, it looks like he's going to hit himself.
Right.
Looks like he's squaring up to himself. And from another angle, so if you go all the way around the sculpture, it looks like he's going to kiss himself. And it was all about, he's kind of, this young fella stood with his tracky bottoms on, he's got his rosary beads on, he's of a certain ilk, bare-chested, and his trainers. So it kind of gives you an idea. He's about 20 years old, this young man. So I did this, and it was all about this internal dialogue that a lot of young people have within themselves and the external pressure of society, where it's kind of like they're meant to look a certain way, act a certain way, be a certain way, and social media is really hammering that home. And so I'd done it from a young man's perspective rather than a young woman's perspective. But it was about this conflict within this like individual young man and within that kind of youth group.
Yeah.
And then about 3 months after I'd completed it, and I couldn't think why I was making it, apart from stuff that I'd observed, there were the riots that happened in, you remember Manchester?
Yeah.
I can't remember when it was, and I was just like, oh my God, that's bizarre. And so that's one example, and it's repeated and repeated and repeated that. And Betty Campbell is another good example of that. So I sculpted this piece of work. I made the piece. The commissioner said, we don't want just a figure on a plinth.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the price that they'd quoted for us, was for a figure on a plinth. But what I did is I shoved the idea of the budget to one side while I was making it and designing it. And then I designed this piece. Then I got a quote from the foundry about 4 days before I needed to do this big presentation in front of BBC cameras, 20 commissioners. And then I got the budget, and the budget came back, annihilated the entire budget for the whole project.
Oh no.
Everything. And I just went, oh my Lord, this is terrible. This is like total humiliation. So that evening I knocked up another piece which did fit the budget. And then I offered the commissioners both. And thankfully they went with the one that was like way more expensive. I didn't get any more, just hasten to add. It was the foundry that got more, not me. But as a result, I made this piece because I just was like, there are no sculptures of black people out there in the public domain. There are no sculptures of women. There are no sculptures of black women.
Yeah. And
so, what I wanted to do was to incorporate all of this kind of information about black history and about the history of Tiger Bay, because it was so relevant to Betty and Betty. Into one piece of work, because I thought this might be the last. Like nobody was interested in public work, and I thought this might be the last. So I chucked all this information into a piece of work.
I'm gonna say, don't make it easy for yourself.
No, I mean, nightmare. But it was just like, this has to be a really significant piece, which is why like my heart and soul went into this, and it's beyond a portrait, that piece, without being too specific. And then 12 months after this happened, 12 months after I got the commission, I was working on the commission, the Colston sculpture was pulled down in Bristol. And Black Lives Matter, I mean, movement really stepped up and came forward, and people started paying attention and asking questions about, who are on these plinths, why are they there, and who aren't on these plinths, and why aren't they there? And so I was just like, oh my Lord, more than ever before, this piece of work is more relevant now. And thankfully, it won't be the only one of, hopefully, of a black person, a black woman, any other woman of any other ethnicity.
Yeah.
Hopefully, there'll be lots of others in the future. But yeah, but that's just an example of how things sort of are thrown sort of together.
Well, how it's meant to be, yeah. How it needed to be here.
Yes, and it's a real honour to know that it's a real honour, but it's also massive responsibility, because when you're taking into account all of these different backgrounds and all of this different information, you need to make sure that you get it right. So, like, I'm a white woman, I get the women aspect of it, but I'm not black, and so I don't know, and I'm not Welsh, so I had to go and work within the community and try and understand what it was like, and talk to the kids that she taught, and talk to her family and her friends and her colleagues, and to try and understand what kind of person she was, what Betty's ethics were, the world that she inhabited. So yeah, it's a massive honour, but yeah, equally huge responsibility.
My goodness, I think you're going to have to just down tools for a little bit when you've finished it completely.
Yeah.
I think I don't know, a little island in the middle of like the ocean somewhere on your own for a while. Just recuperate. Maybe your daughter's allowed to come.
Yeah.
Oh, well, just finally, tell us a little bit more about the Emily sculpture. Tell us a little bit about what your inspiration was for her. Obviously the person herself, but the way that you've put her together in your maquette.
So Emily, another one, I've been asked to go for other projects in the past, and I just haven't, because they've not been relevant. And then I came across the Emily Commission and just kind of went, oh my God, she's brilliant. And and I've got I could definitely work with this. So from my perspective, it was, I guess it comes from the perspective of Emily being kind of the eco-warrior, and it comes from the understanding as well, or the message behind things like, ecology and conservation. Really, I think that piece of work talks about two things. It talks about Emily as a woman, and a couple of things. Why did we not know about her? Why did her own great niece, not know about her? And look at all the amazing things. Three women, all three the co-founders. These three women have changed the lives and habitats of these birds and creatures that live within this, the RSPB reserves, so it's a combination of Emily, this strong, as far as we understand, quietly dignified, but eco-warrior. I mean, she must have been made out of tough stuff to stand against the other posh women within her society, and get them not to wear hats full of feathers. And then the lower section of the piece is, so the top section is quite traditional. The lower section of the piece is, which is her crinoline dress, is actually made into a habitat for the birds that she saved, and that the RSPB, her legacy, continue to save. So there are all stories that go on within her dress. So there's all the birds that she rescued when she was from the fur and feather trade, from the feather particularly trade. So she saved the great crested grebe. Well, actually, no, she didn't. That was one of her favourite birds.
Species, yeah.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it was hunted in this country to extinction.
Yeah.
And now, it's been brought back by the RSPB, and now it's flourishing. It's known as a common bird now. But all of the birds within Emily's dress that I've sculpted, so there are owls in there, there's an albatross, there are finches, there's a puffin because they're on the red endangered list. There's, oh my goodness, there's loads. Endless as a kingfisher. So each one of them has a story within it, and it was either endangered back in Emily's day when she was alive, or it's endangered now and needs help. There's also a couple of dioramas. So the idea with this piece of work is that you don't just go to it and go and clock it kind of out of the corner of your eye and go, yeah, got that woman stood on a plinth holding a bird, or whatever. You kind of want to go into it and you want to see more and ask questions like, why is that there?
Yeah.
And all of my work, I try and encourage that the commissioners also get at least a website, and we're sort of I'm also working with some augmented reality people so that you can actually view the piece while you're there through your phone, and it animates the piece. So it tells the story. It doesn't just stop with the sculpture. It continues to educate, basically. And I see all the work that I do now with regards to the public realm as a tool for education.
Yeah, I'm desperate for them to be able to get virtual reality so that you can create the sculpture and you can put your virtual reality headset on and walk around it and it's the right size, and it can't be that far off before we can do that, right?
So I'm working with a company to do that.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
How exciting.
Yeah. So I'm working with a company. It took ages to find this company, and then found out that we were just on my doorstep. I went out throughout the world looking for this, particularly with the Betty project. Yeah, and with the Emily project as well, should that come off. So the idea is that, that you go with, I think with lockdown, it's been a big wake-up call in some ways where, museums have been closed and these educational centres have been closed, but you could still go outside.
Yeah.
And you could still go into your city centre, or you could still go into nature. So in theory, these pieces of work, you could easily have a website or have augmented reality, some sort of virtual reality, where you utilise the sculpture as a kind of museum, right? So that you can get all this information and you don't have to go indoors. I'm not saying just for if we have times like this again, but you can still educate.
But even if we don't, just as many different ways of accessing sculpture as possible, please.
Yeah, and I think, if the sculpture lends itself to that, which I think, the sort of work that I do these days, it lends it, because it's multi-layered. I mean, you can see, if you look at the Emily Williams statue website, you'll see all 4 of our designs, and there's some brilliant designs in there, and each and every one of them, I think, tells a completely different story or a different aspect of Emily, which I think is fantastic. And you can really just see which one floats your boat, and then you're allowed to vote on it, which I think is a great way. The one that I've done, if that sort of thing floats your boat, then it's very much, it tells all these stories within the piece. So I was just about to tell you, so around the back of the piece there are these little dioramas, and these dioramas are of people. So you've got all these birds, but then hidden there's also these 2 dioramas so far of people, and one of them it depicts the feather workers, because the feather workers used to employ the work within the millinery industry that the word birds were butchered for. They used to employ, kids as young as 4 and 5 to work with quite toxic chemicals for 13-hour shifts a day. It was, these women had, and that was the little girls. The women had awful lives. So that depicts the more gritty side of that barbarous kind of industry. And another little diorama that depicts Emily's. She was also very much into social work, and she opened a college for nursing where she encouraged the nurses to use real children and babies as opposed to dolls, which is what they were doing before that. And so there's a little diorama where there's an old kind of nurse with the long skirt on and holding the hand of a little baby. If you look at the maquette, it's so small. It's probably about 3 centimetres tall. It's absolutely midget. But these will obviously be translated 1¼ times life size, so that it'd be much more understandable.
Obvious.
Obvious but hidden.
Yes, so obvious but hidden.
Going back. Yeah, you can keep going back and then going, oh look, you never noticed that, and and why is that in there?
Sounds magnificent.
Oh, bless you.
So tell everyone where they can find out a little bit more about you if they'd like to have a look at more of your work.
Well, they could look at my website that obviously needs updating because I'm creative, and most of us seem to say that, which is www.eveshepherd.com. You could also have a look online. I've got Twitter feed is UK Sculpture, or Instagram. I kind of do all 3, is Facebook and Instagram, and Instagram's just my name. I think it's Eve Shepherd Sculpture.
Very good. And I encourage everyone to have a look on the Emily Williamson Sculpture Campaign website and vote. Definitely vote.
Yeah, I think that they've got, last time I spoke to Andrew, who's organising the campaign, I think they had just short of 6,000 votes.
Brilliant.
So, but it's really important, that I think people go and they check it out if they're interested in conservation, the RSPB, Emily Williamson, public work,
Yeah.
any of those lead-ins, go and check it out and have a
Well,
voice.
goodness, I think if they can't manage to get the funds from all those members of the RSPB for that sculpture, I'd be
Yeah,
surprised. I mean, this is one
yeah.
that I'm optimistic about. So,
It's great. It's such a brilliant opportunity as well. I mean, I just think all of these sculptures of women, that are coming out into the public domain, it's just like, thank the Lord. It's
yeah,
been
it's too
such a
long.
long time. Yeah, I mean, it's great. I did some work with the National Maritime Museum a few years ago, and that was the start of all this. And I worked with kids from refugee communities. Again, that's another one that's not been depicted positively. And there's also, I worked with the Girl Guides, which depicted women and girls again. And what was the third one? The LGBT community, again, massively underrepresented. So yeah, I just think it's a really exciting time for public sculpture.
Oh, well,
I feel,
Eve, thank you
yeah,
ever so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
thank you. And thanks for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure. I love your program.
Oh,
I've
thank
listened to all
you.
of them. When you told me about Sculpture Vulture, I was like, oh my word, these are brilliant. And can I just say, a fantastic resource for sculptors, because I don't know about like other sculptors out there, but we spend so much time on our own in our studios, battling away, trying to find our way around things. I mean, it could be business, it could be this, it could be that. It's so nice to hear when, a resource like yours to sort of go, oh God, it's not just me. They struggle with that as well. Oh, good. I feel human again.
Eve is my kind of girl. She's a warm and genuine character, and also someone that gets right to the heart of the matter. That might be a northern thing, lack of fluff, but I can really appreciate that as my roots are buried deep in the north. But it also could just be the core of who Eve is. A great example of this was her summing up of what it is to be a sculptor. And just in case anyone's out there wondering whether or not they might be a sculptor, Eve has got a formula for it. She sums it up. Curiosity plus practical skills equals sculptor. And what wisdom she imparts when she talks about being a healthy sculptor and the hairy moments that she's had in her career. I mean, Eve has literally broken her back from overwork. Now, that's usually just a figure of speech for most people, but it didn't break her creative spirit. She views it as a rite of passage now. Maybe she didn't do it at the time, but now that's what it means to her. And it's limited the quantity of work that she can actually produce, but it's forced her to concentrate only on producing the work that she really feels needs to come into the world. And that's really resonated with me. I loved how she described getting a handle on her creative desires, that it was a form in a way of growing up. And I'd never thought about it that way before, but shedding the kind of giddiness that you have as a child, that dashing around and being attracted to all sorts of shiny things instead of plotting your path more carefully. But she now considers what it's worth her life force being poured into and what it just isn't. I particularly struggle with this myself, and I don't know, it might be a trait of my personality. I have a tendency to move rather than sit and think, and one of the things that has helped me with this particular problem is a catchphrase. I think it's Tim Ferriss who coined it. I'm not quite sure if it's definitely his, but he says, if it's not a hell yes, then it should be a no. And the reason that has helped me more than anything else is that I am not good at dealing with grey areas. And I'm going to bring it right back to Eve's formula. I think it's because creatives are hugely curious people, and you can start digging around in the grey areas. You can start getting lost in grey areas and following down paths that you just shouldn't be on. And so I know that it's something I have to be mindful about on my own journey. I'm sure you'll join me in wishing Eve all the best with the Emily Williamson competition. Do go and look at the pictures of her entry. They are particularly fantastic. And more importantly, go and vote on the competition. Let's get Emily Williamson made. Coming up in the next episode, I'm going to be dropping in one of my practical episodes, which, as of this moment, I think I'm going to christen Things to Keep in Mind About Plinths and Dangly Bits. I'll leave you with that thought and hope that you will tune in next episode to find out what that means. Please don't forget to support the show. You can do this by buying one of my novels or my non-fiction work, Bronze Behaving Badly. And if you're somebody that is more of a doer rather than a spender, I've got lots of respect for that, you can help the podcast by helping to enlarge the audience. Please share your favourite episode on social media. Tell other sculptors or people that are interested in sculpture all about it and get them to tune in. If you're looking for a new book, please consider one of my novels about the dark side of the art world, where sculpture is always at the heart of the story. You can get them on the show website, on the usual online retailers, or even better, keep your local library alive, ask for them in there. Thank you for joining me today. Sculpture Vulture has been brought to you by Antique Bronze.